And thank you so much for joining us for the Security Strategy, How to Keep Your Data Safe in the Cloud webinar. My name is Katie Bolt, and I'm the Business Development Associate here at Lear. Before we get into the presentation, I just want to cover a couple housekeeping items. Everyone is placed on mute for the duration of the presentation. There's just going to be one poll question at the beginning of the webinar, and we would love for your participation. Please submit any questions you have in the Q&A portal at the bottom of the screen, and Rachel will answer those at the end. And also, a recording of today's presentation will be sent out in a couple of days. And today's recording, as well as all past Lear webinar recordings, are available on our Lear YouTube channel and lear.com. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Rachel, for today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Katie. I'll get into the agenda to start things off. First, I'll go through some introductions. I'll kind of give a brief overview of my background and my experience with security. And then in terms of the security overview, we'll be doing a discussion on job roles, security profiles, data roles, provisioning roles to users, whether that's manual or through auto provisioning rules, and then finally some security best practices, which I'll kind of touch on throughout, but I will have kind of a tips and tricks portion towards the end of the presentation, and then we'll end it with a Q&A. So a little bit about me. My name is Rachel Rudolph. I've been a consultant with Lear for over 3 years now. And I am Oracle Cloud certified. I'm a certified implementation specialist in the core HR, talent management, and benefits modules. I've been a part of several large-scale implementation projects over the course of the past 3 years. And I do also have prior experience in HR analytics, so I can kind of see things a little bit from the client side as well as the consulting side. Brief overview about Lear before we get started with some security stuff. It was established in 2005, so we've celebrated over 15 years of business at this point. Hopefully we'll have a big party next year when this craziness is all over. We help our clients by partnering with them to efficiently implement, integrate, and upgrade their software investments. And we also have a really excellent strategic advisory services practice. So they kind of lay the groundwork, they do business process mapping, they do various analyses, and that kind of helps lead the way for successful implementation projects. So between that and managed services, we really help out on all sides of a project as well as after the project concludes. And we consider ourselves a trusted advisor to our clients and a thought leader in the industry. And we're also recognized as a member of Oracle's Cloud Excellence Implementer Program. So security can be very complex, and it's something that's a bit hard to grasp. So I want to give a really well-rounded overview of how security works in HCM Cloud.
Thank you, Rachel. So here is our first and only poll question of the day. And it is going to be, how familiar are you with Oracle Cloud Security? Are you an expert, intermediate, a beginner, or this is the first time you've ever heard of it? I'll give about 30 seconds to answer here. So it looks like the majority of you are beginners and learning to get more familiar with security. So thank you. Back to you, Rachel.
All right, thank you, Katie. So that's perfect. This is a really good baseline overview of how security works in the cloud. And kind of starting from the very beginning with security roles, there are two primary types of roles, both controlling the functions a user can perform. So the abstract role is who you are rather than your job. My job is not going to be a line manager or an employee. That's more of who I am in the company. And these are the most often used abstract roles, but contingent worker is a really common one as well. So you can see your job title wouldn't be contingent worker or employee. That's why it's considered to be an abstract role rather than a job role. And since these are so commonly provisioned, these are the roles that you're going to want to set up auto provisioning rules based on whatever your business requirements are. You're not going to want to either add or take away the employee role every time you have a hire or turn. So it's a really good idea to set up those auto provisioning rules, but I will get more in depth in that a bit later on in the presentation. Job roles, on the other hand, they are segregated by module. You have primarily you'll have them in HR, benefits, compensation, payroll, but there's also some associated with time and labor, and now with ORC. Job roles that involve employee transactions are never assigned directly to a user. So again, I will get into this a little bit more in depth later on in the presentation, but Oracle will give you a seated HR specialist role, but you would first have to create a data role to indicate which data they could view before assigning to a user. And then finally, job roles will be combined with security profiles to create that data role, which is then assigned to the user. So it's a little bit of a three-step process with job roles, whereas if you are working with a security role that doesn't involve employee transactions, those can more so be assigned directly to the user. All right, so the most common job roles used in the HR module, that's going to be HR specialist. This one is given out most commonly, and it's just kind of the role that can control any sort of employee transaction. So they have access into person management, which then gives them access to updating the assignment screen, the salary, the talent profile even, because that's under the core HR umbrella. Additionally, you have access into the workforce structures, so you could modify, jobs, positions, that kind of thing, business units. You can also do mass updates. Say there's a mass change, maybe a department's, you need to transfer a whole department to a different department, that kind of thing. You can configure talent management in core with the HR specialists, and absence management as well, because those two modules don't really have their own roles. They also fall under the core HR umbrella. The HR analyst, this is a really common role used for reporting. You can also have access into the assignment screen on the front end. So I can access a lot of areas that an HR specialist would, but I'm going to not have any edit capabilities, but it's a really useful role, and it's very widely used. And then finally, the HCM application administrator. This is going to be more of your setup and maintenance type thing. This will give you access to the functional setup manager. And you can also do personalizations, descriptive flex fields, which are very commonly used, and then your list of values. So updating, maybe you're within the assignment screen and you need to change a job. Adding, additional jobs to that list is something you'd be able to do on the admin side. So this is when it gets a little bit trickier. You start with your job role, and then security profiles are going to be what you assign to the job role to create a data role. So there's a few different categories of security profiles, and these are going to be used to define what data can be accessed by the user in the assigned role. And this is something that's actually accessed through setup and maintenance, whereas a lot of other more day-to-day security tasks are accessed through Security Console. So this is more on the setup side and will be in the functional setup manager. Oracle does deliver a handful of view all security profiles, but you can also create your own. So here are some of Oracle's seeded security profiles. The categories you can secure by person, you can secure by organization, position, legislative data group, country is a common one, and then document type, payroll, and payroll flow. So what they basically provide is view all into these different areas. So you could view all countries, you could view all positions, but where you would come in with creating your own is limiting maybe it only to certain positions or certain countries or certain people. So I'll get a little bit more into that in later slides, but that's kind of how it works in a broad sense. So person security profiles, this is the most commonly used security profile in my experience, and that's going to control who a person can access and perform functions on. So there's a few different ways to go about securing the person security profile, and you can do this by areas of responsibility, which is, in again my experience, the most common way to do it. as well as manager hierarchy and person types. Security profiles, I did mention this earlier, but they are not needed for system admin and setup roles like IT security manager and application implementation consultant, because those roles are associated with different work areas that are really just for setup purposes. I'm not going into search employees and update their data at all. That's very specific to those HR benefits compensation roles. So it's not even necessary to assign security profiles, and that role can be assigned directly to the user. So here are some examples. This is a little bit from the class, the older UI, but the essence is definitely the same. So you have view all workers. So this is a really common person security profile to assign to various roles. This is in contrast to view all people. If you can view all people, then you're seeing terminated workers and contacts as well. So you're gonna probably wanna assign view all workers to someone who's, say, a compensation analyst who won't be dealing with contacts or terminated workers necessarily. View manager hierarchy, this is very specific to the line manager role. So if I'm going through and I'm assigning a person's security profile to a line manager, I don't want them to see all of the workers' data. I want them to see their direct and indirect reports only. So this is just kind of limiting it, saying, yes, you have a little bit of expanded access, but it's really just within your hierarchy. View own record, this is what's going to be used for the employee. So I'm going in and I'm assigning security profiles to the employee role. I, again, don't want them to see all workers in the organization. I don't want them to see, likely they don't have a hierarchy, they don't have direct or indirect reports. And so it's just limited to their own personal data. And then finally, you can create so many different types of custom person security profiles. In the past, I've personally created it for certain users can only see certain job families. And so I would go in and I would create an area of responsibility, an HR specialist for job family X. And then you create the person security profile to just kind of correspond with that. And then assign it to the user. They're only able to see users in that, or employees in that job family. So this one is really, really common. View no HR. If you're working in HR, there's often a policy that you can't view other HR employees' data. So this is just assuming the HR is segmented by departments. This means that you can view all departments except the HR department. So that's kind of controlled through person security profiles. So the 4 seeded security profiles that you can't edit, although you can create your own versions as what you just saw: view all people, view all workers, view manager hierarchy, and view on records. So those come out of the box. You're gonna use all of those quite regularly, most commonly view all workers. And then kind of a best practice or a tip is some data roles may need person to be view all people, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, because they need to see terminated workers and contacts. So examples of this is employee contacts for HR specialists and benefits roles. HR often needs to access emergency contacts, and benefits needs to understand dependents and beneficiaries. So you're expanding outside of your organization there, and you're going to need to make sure they can see all people rather than just employees. This also applies for performance documents for HR or anyone in talent, quick pay for payroll, and time card creation for time and labor admin. These are just roles that are likely going to be in contact with terminated worker records, so it needs to be expanded to view all people. So the process is, we went through job roles, we talked about security profiles, and now we're gonna kind of discuss how security profiles come together with job roles to create data roles. It's a lot of terminology, but basically you assign security profiles to data roles to secure the data according to whatever your business requirements may be. They're again used to define what data and whose data can be accessed by the user in the assigned role. And we went through all of these person security profiles, but person, organization, position, those are just different ways that you can limit access, just depending on your business requirements. It all depends. And then the data role is that combination of the job role and whatever security profiles that you indicate. So a good example would be HR specialist. That's going to be your job role, because oftentimes if you work in HR, your job title might be HR specialist. So that makes it a job role rather than an abstract role. The security profile is going to be country, because in this example, the HR specialist, maybe they're the HR specialist for only Australia and New Zealand. It's a bigger corporation, and they just kind of separate it by region or country. So this person can't see someone who lives or works in the US. They're only limited to employees that work in Australia or New Zealand. So once that security profile, Australia, New Zealand, is assigned to my job role of HR specialist, I now have a data role, HR specialist, Australia, New Zealand. So that's just kind of a simple example. There's so many different ways you can do it. Again, I've done it by job families as an example. So it's just depending on your business requirements, but there's a lot of flexibility with that. So some notes about data roles. Abstract roles can actually be directly edited to assign the security profiles. So you don't have to go ahead and create a new data role. You could search in your task for employee or line manager and just kind of edit and then assign your security profiles from there. But that's not something you could do for human resources specialists. Job roles should never be assigned directly to, should never be directly edited to security profiles. When I was first starting out and I didn't know as much about security, I made the mistake of doing this, and it led to a lot of downstream impacts where people couldn't see what they needed to see. You just, especially as you're creating more and more data roles, for instance, if you have someone who's the HR specialist in Australia, New Zealand versus the HR specialist in the US, if you're modifying, if you're using the seated job role, then you are basically drawing your security profiles from the seated role, and it's going to flow to your other data roles. And therefore, when they should only be seeing Australia, New Zealand, they might be able to see all workers instead. So it's kind of your source for those other data roles, and it should not be touched. And Oracle will not provide any seeded data roles. That's something you do have to do at the beginning of an implementation project. And you do need to continually go in and regenerate the data security grants, but that is a manual step in there. And the job or abstract role will dictate which security profiles are available to populate on the data role. So certain roles, maybe like compensation analyst, they don't need to assign a security profile concerning payroll or the payroll flow. The security profiles that are relevant to the role will appear for selection. So it just makes it a little bit easier. You're not selecting from as many drop downs, having to think about what they can and cannot see. So this is kind of outlines what I'm talking about when you're not assigning security profiles directly to the role. Instead, you're creating the role. So in the example on the screenshot, we have an Alir HR specialist view all. So there's nothing really too special about the security. It's pretty wide open, but I'm creating one that's still company specific. And then I'm going to search for human resource specialists, which is the seated role right below. And that's going to bring in all of my functional security privileges. It's kind of my source, but I'm still creating a new data role from there. And then for the abstract roles, this would be kind of a step that you would skip. You would instead edit the seated role and assign security profiles from there. So in general, when it comes to assigning roles to users, you're going to do more of the one-off role assignments in the security console, because that is your day-to-day area that you'll kind of, if you're in, if you have IT security manager, if you own security for your organization, you will just spend a lot of time in Security Console. But for the initial setup, you're going to want to set up auto provisioning rules. And this is just something where you can use different criteria to assign roles like employee and line manager, so that you're not having to frequently go in and add these roles. It's just a lot less manual work. And you can effective date and end date provisioning rule. So if you only want, a certain maybe job role to be assigned out for a certain period of time, you do have control over that. So that's a nice feature. And you can assign more than one data or job or abstract role to users using single mapping criteria. So say like everyone with this job code who has an active assignment status needs this role, and this role. You can make that kind of all wrapped up into one. But a limitation is you can't select multiple criteria. So it can be if someone has this job code and this job code, they get these roles. You'd have to create multiple roles for each job code. And then a best practice would be to schedule the process auto provision roles for all users to run daily. It is a dynamic change, so it generally will update, but it's just something that you want to do. It's just a best practice in general to have various security processes run daily just to make sure everything's synced up, because you can run into big issues if people are not receiving the roles that they need to get in order to do their job or to see the data they need to see. Or on the other hand, if they have reduced access, you want that to be updated as quickly as possible as well. And another thing to note is that this process should be run manually after conversion loads of new person records, just because it's going to generally be a lot of new person records, and it's something that just needs to be refreshed. So there are two very common examples for auto provisioning, and the first one I'll touch on is line manager. I'll go through the employee rule in the next slide, but you can specify only one value for each of these conditions. So kind of an example would be HR assignment status. Maybe you have active payroll eligible, but you also want people to receive the role if they're active payroll or no payroll. But you'd have to instead create two roles, unfortunately. You can just select one value at a time. And then you can set up a rule based on a different job code, and to have its own mapping. So you could have multiple roles kind of listed on the bottom portion of the screenshot. You could have, you could have 2+ roles for these the same set of criteria. So in this example, we have the rule name as line manager, and then you'll have the system person type as employee, HR assignment status as active, and a manager reports that flag must be set to yes. So if the person meets this criteria, they're automatically going to get line manager, and you won't have to do anything in terms of assigning them roles. And kind of the same thing with employee. It's very similar. It's a simple rule. You have the system person type as employee and the HR assignment status set to active. And then you make sure to add the role employee below in the associated roles section, and then you will check the auto provision box, and it should be every time someone's hired on and meets this criteria, or maybe changes assignment statuses from on leave to active, they will automatically receive the employee role. So it's a lot less manual work, and it's just it's a best practice to at least do auto provisioning for employee and line manager. So a quick Security Console overview. The Security Console is a simplified UI that's used to kind of manage user accounts, and also it's used for administration, like password. If you have a strong password versus a less strong password, you would indicate that here, kind of the password requirements, as well as different user account categories. And this is just access on the front end through the navigator, tools, and security console. And it's also where you can kind of analyze roles and the privileges. And this is where you can not only copy a role to kind of modify it, but you can also compare roles, which is extremely useful. And it's probably the feature I use the most in the security console. And then just some things to note with release and upgrade management. If you have created custom roles, which is highly recommended against, you will want to use that compare feature to see if Oracle had added any privileges to their seeded roles. And if you need to either add or remove privileges from your custom roles in order to kind of meet to make sure that your users are still able to see everything they need to see and you're using those newer features. And then 2 quick things you should do after every upgrade. There are a lot of processes you should set to run daily, but some more ad hoc processes would be retrieve latest LDAP changes and regenerate data roles, just to make sure everyone's seeing the appropriate data. And then kind of just to wrap it up, some security best practices. You can assign security profiles directly to abstract roles, those employee and line manager roles. You should only assign a job role directly to a user if they're not touching any sort of person records, more of the admin type roles. And you shouldn't apply security profiles to seeded job roles. Instead, you'd be creating that data role that indicates what kind of data they can see. And you should schedule security processes. There's a good list in the Oracle white paper that concerns security. Most of them will be run daily. Again, some of them are a little bit more ad hoc. And then limit your custom roles. This is the biggest recommendation I can give. There is a lot you can do within the structure area and within HCM Experience Design Studio that is just way better, way easier to maintain than adding and removing privileges from the delivered roles. So I would say, kind of in conclusion, the really important step of security is understanding how job, abstract, and data roles work together and their relationship to security profiles. Utilize those auto provisioning rules. Ensure you have security processes scheduled appropriately, and avoid security customizations whenever possible. And the supporting documentation is that securing HCM doc that I referenced earlier, and that's just an Oracle white paper.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Out of respect of just everyone's time, we'll follow up with everyone individually on any questions that were submitted. And just to wrap up here, there are 2 additional webinars that are going to be coming up that might be interest of you or anyone in your organization. And this is a part of the Alir Learning Lab series. One of them is on PeopleSoft to OCI on October 6th, and the second is on OTBI and BI Publisher, which is going to be happening on November 11th. And below is Rachel and I's contact information. So if you have any questions, feel free to just send us an email. And as always, just please engage with Alir on social media. We post new content weekly on all of our different channels. And thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.